People of the internet, we are debating how bad is economic equality, and we are starting right now with Dr. Ben Burgis and Sphincter of Doom. Let me give it to you guys for your introductions. Dr. Burgis, I'll let you go first.
Sure. So I am an adjunct philosophy professor at Morehouse College and a columnist for Jacobin. And guess publisher would be mad if I didn't plug this. So it just came out a week ago. Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why He Still Matters, which I should say, by the way, anybody who goes to the event in Dallas next weekend and wants a signed copy, I will definitely bring a few with me.
And Sphincter of Doom.
Hi, I'm Sphincter of Doom. I don't have my own channel yet. I'm a chemical engineer. I minored in philosophy, but I do not teach it, no. And there's not much else to say about me.
All right, thank you so much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me just get my notes back up on the screen, if I may. All right, so tonight we have Dr. Ben Burgis going first to lead things off with his opening statement of 12 minutes each. Then we have a 55-minute opening discussion and then 30 minutes of Q&A. I want to let everybody know that if this is your first time at Modern Day Debate, that we are a neutral platform hosting debates on science, religion, and politics. And we want you to feel welcome no matter what walk of life you're from. If you have any questions or comments for tonight's debaters, please fire them into the old live chat and be sure to tag me at Modern Day Debates. Super chats go to the top of the lists, and we ask that you please keep your conversation civil, both in the chat and with your comments. Attack the argument and not the person. Insults will not be read, and that goes for the general discourse in the live chat as well. Our invaluable moderators are working tirelessly to elevate the conversation, so please show them the respect that they deserve, and each other as well, the debaters as well. Please respect each other and not hurl personal attacks and insults. Our guests are linked in the description below, so if you like what you're hearing on YouTube or the podcast, please click their links and check them out. And hit the like, share, and subscribe button so you can keep this channel growing and growing. I don't know if you've heard or not, but there's a debate conference coming up in a couple weeks, the 15th and the 16th. And then tomorrow night we have another debate. Evolution is going to be debated with Dr. Cy Gart and Jen from Church of Entropy. And with that, we're going to go ahead and kick it to the opening statements. Dr. Ben Burgis, you have the floor.
All right. Thanks, Kaz. And thank you, Josh. Other than this one time, I'm not going to say Sphincter of Doom. So thank you, Josh, for still wanting to do this, even with all the trouble we had scheduling it and all of my nitpickiness about how to frame the issue in the title. When we were exchanging suggestions about what to call it, one of the ideas floated around was economic inequality on trial. In that analogy, I guess I'd be the prosecutor, but of course, it would have been a pretty misleading analogy because even if I can convince everyone watching that economic inequality is very, very bad, there is no judge here to enforce a verdict. We can't debate our way to a more equal society. At a certain point, you have to actually log off and do things like talk to your coworkers about organizing a union. But right now, let's talk about why I think egalitarian values are worth going out there to fight for. I'm certainly not going to argue that we should empower some dystopian bureaucracy to ration everything out to make sure everyone has a exactly equal share of every resource. When I say that economic inequality is indeed very bad, I don't mean that anytime anyone has a little bit more than anyone else, that's necessarily unjust. What I do mean is the kind of raging inequality that's normal in contemporary capital society. The average CEO in a large firm earns hundreds of times what the average fully employed worker makes. And a lot of people are doing much worse than that average full-time employee who has a pension and benefits because they're either underemployed or they're overemployed, stringing together gig economy jobs without benefits or any sense of security for the future. And yeah, I find that kind of inequality grotesque. To illustrate why it's grotesque, I could start talking about sweatshops in Haiti that are subsidiaries of crazy wealthy American corporations, or even staying within the borders of the United States. I could talk about the gap in life expectancy between the richest and poorest zip codes. But instead of any of that, I'd actually prefer, I think it might be more instructive even to focus on a mundane, everyday example of what significant economic inequality looks like, the kind of example that feels so normal to people who spent their entire lives living in a grotesquely unequal society that oftentimes, if you're at the bottom end of this, it doesn't even occur to you to think of it as an injustice. It just seems like, yeah, that's how life is. So here's the example. A trust fund kid might be able to spend a gap year in India finding himself between high school and college. Meanwhile, his parents pay their cleaning lady, let's say, they don't just pay her enough for rent and groceries. She has some spending money, but certainly not enough for her to fly off to any of the places that she might like to visit. Her lack of funds stop her from boarding a plane to any of those places in exactly the same way that she'd be stopped if the TSA put her on a no-fly list. In both scenarios, if she tries to board the plane anyway, men with guns will use force to stop her. And that last point is worth circling and underlining. Some people will say, no, we shouldn't be trying to create a more equal society. We shouldn't be thinking about moving from capitalism to some form of democratic socialism, because equality can only be purchased at the cost of freedom. They say capitalism is a system of uncoerced free exchanges, whereas if we try to make society more socialistic by doing things like, for example, nationalizing big corporations, that's coercion. But this is just a rhetorical sleight of hand. Any distribution of scarce resources is ultimately enforced by coercion. That's what's threatened by a no trespassing sign, every bit as much as it's threatened by a bill from the IRS. In fact, in practice, ignoring the first is a hell of a lot more likely to actually lead to a confrontation with armed agents of the state than ignoring the second. So the issue and dispute in arguments about capitalism and socialism and equality and inequality is not coercion, yes or no. It's which distribution of scarce resources should be coercively enforced. And you shouldn't trust anyone who doesn't make that distinction. Now, I've been speaking at a very general, intuitive level, but to make this a little more precise, I think there are at least 4 kinds of objectionable economic inequality. 1, I object to any level of inequality that makes us less free. If you have so much less than others that you're completely dependent on the goodwill of people with more to meet your needs, those people with more have a lot of power to make you do what they want. That kind of soft coercion isn't as bad as slavery or forced labor, but it's still pretty bad. And if there's a good way to restructure economic institutions so no one is put in that situation by their lack of material resources, we should do that. By the way, that point about how capitalism doesn't have to be as bad as even more coercive systems like feudalism or ancient slave systems that existed in the past in order to be bad is the same reason I'm annoyed when people like Steven Pinker make a big deal of pointing out how much better poor people in 2022 have it than their ancestors who lived under previous forms of social organization. My beef isn't that it's false. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's true. Even we don't have to go back to distant ancestors. But my objection is that true or false, it's 100% irrelevant. The same way that racial discrimination in housing or employment was surely less than 0.1% as bad as the Middle Passage, but it was still a serious injustice that needed to be redressed. All right, that's 1. 2, I object to inequality in power. The same way it was unjust when women couldn't vote, and the reason it was unjust is there was no good reason why women should have less power over the direction of society than men. That exact same objection applies to any kind of economic inequality severe enough to result in an inequality of political influence in the state. And the point about equality of power applies just as much to what goes on within a workplace. In fact, grotesque levels of inequality in distribution of resources are not totally, but to a great extent, downstream from inequality of power within firms. In a worker co-op where everyone gets to vote on wage scales, you won't necessarily get a completely equal distribution. You might convince your fellow workers that you need to get paid a little more to give you a reason to take on positions with more responsibility and stress, or conversely, for doing particularly dirty and unpleasant jobs. But good luck trying to convince them that you have to get hundreds of times more than they get. 3, even in a society that wasn't divided into workers and capitalists, if it worked out that economic inequality got so severe that people at the bottom end had just a dramatically worse quality of life because of that, miserable, stressed out about money all the time, can't spend time with their loved ones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and making the distribution of material resources more equal would correct that situation. then at least all else being equal, I think a principle of communal caring gives us a reason to do that the same way you might spend some of your individual resources on helping a family member who is in trouble. And no, I don't think it's realistic or even necessarily desirable for everyone to care exactly as much about random strangers as they care about their own families. But there is a hell of a gap separating caring about someone quite that much from being so callous towards them that you let them sink to the point where they have to start a GoFundMe to pay for their medical bills. 4, I believe in equality of opportunity. That means that if there's a reasonable way to avoid this, no one should have less access to the resources they need to live a better version of their life because of factors outside of their control. This is the exact reason why we think it's outrageous, for example, if members of racial minority groups have a smaller share of society's resources just because of the color of their skin. Lack of access to resources because of factors outside of your control. Now, a lot of defenders of the capitalist status quo would say, oh, we agree with you about that one. We also believe in equality of opportunity. But the fact is they really don't, or at least they don't believe in any particularly deep version of it. Because if, for example, some people can inherit fortunes from their parents and all they have to do is not fritter it away, and other people have to work 2 jobs and drive an Uber at night to make ends meet, that's a clear-cut case of some people having less access to scarce resources than others do because of factors outside of their control. Now, you will notice that I've used a few phrases like all else being equal, or if there's a good way to do this. And the reason I've used those phrases is because I'm speaking at the level of values, but I do recognize that politics is complicated. And sometimes important values have to be balanced against other values that are also important. And this is the last point I want to get into before I throw it to Josh. If you can convince me that we have to allow large-scale inequality because the only alternative is economic collapse and everyone being way worse off than even the worst off people are now, so that, someone in the society we live in right now, for example, who's working 2 jobs and, what I just said, driving Uber at night to pay for rent and groceries, but still manages to make enough to pay for food for themselves and litter and cat food for their cats, we're saying in this hypothetical that if things were made more equal, there'd be so little to go around that they'd have to resort to eating those cats so they didn't starve to death. If you can convince me of that those were the options, then sure, I would reluctantly allow large-scale inequality as a necessary evil. I'd still think it was evil, but I might be convinced that it was a necessary evil. But I'll end by just saying that if anyone seriously wants to make the case that there's no way to make our society, at the very least, dramatically more equal than it is right now, without making the worst off people worse off than they are already, well, as the subject of that book I mentioned earlier might put it, all your work is still ahead of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burgis, for that great opening discussion. And now we're going to go ahead and kick it over to Josh, also known as the Sphincter of Doom.
Ooh. So I want to thank you guys for having me. Admittedly, my opening is a bit short. I much wanted to just save time to get into the meat of our arguments. So it's not going to address. I didn't anticipate everything you were going to say, but I'll just get into it. And where to go? A lot of hay has been made about economic inequality and its moral and economic implications, in concluding that it is harmful or immoral. But I would submit much of this is more haywire thinking. There are critical oversights in the evaluations, to wit, special pleading or circular reasoning. These arguments generally fall into one of 2 categories: picking only time periods or countries where a trend of inequality being bad is synthesized, or using metrics that are unfalsifiable. A good first example is Piketty Say's book, one which helped galvanize a very discussion on inequality, but his findings look only at specific non-continuous years in the 20th century, and he doesn't even account for the depreciation of capital assets over time. When one does so, one shouldn't be surprised when capital values outpace and accumulate faster than others. Another example is a famous TED Talk regarding the spirit level, a book by British policy advocate Richard G. Wilkinson, wherein his choice of which countries to trend to demonstrate more equal societies are better off, various metrics like crime rates, happiness, social mobility, But he chooses different countries for those trends from metric to metric. And the most glaring omission of which is Singapore, which has more inequality than the US, but it's absent in every single one of his trends, with the exception of the one that fits his metric, which happens to be in the incarceration rate. We can then look at social mobility arguments like those found in Robert Reich's Inequality for All. Here, the argument is that inequality creates less economic mobility, but the measurement of economic mobility here is relative mobility from one income quantile to another, not absolute earning power. When inequality is higher, the relative quantiles would be further apart. So even an absolute increase in earning power equal to or even sometimes greater than a similar one in a country that has less inequality will appear to be less impactful, when in reality, that person is equally or even better off. Similarly, economists like Richard Wolff will point to the relative real gains in income by income quantile over time, pointing to the much higher gains for the rich and lower or even negative gains for the lowest quantiles. What this argument fails to account for is the distinction between statistical categories and flesh and blood people. Who actually occupies the 1%, or any quantile, varies over time. And indeed, there's a lot more flux into and out of the highest and the lowest income quantiles annually. It actually turns out that about 1 in 9 Americans will find themselves in the 1% at least at one point in their lifetime. And of those in the 1% that persist to stay in the 1% for 10 years or more, that only comprises about 10 to 11% of the 1%. All these arguments overlook a critical question that to be asked regarding inequality. How are real people affected? What is their absolute earning power? We don't buy things by our portion of GDP or our portion of the total AGI. We buy it in whatever the legal tender is. How much do people have and how far it goes is the real question. If the amount they have is too low, that's an issue, and it's an issue of absolute poverty, but not relative poverty. And absolute poverty occurs independently of relative poverty. Singapore has one of the highest levels of income inequality in the world. It's even higher than the US. Yet there is little absolute poverty, all with lower taxes and a less extensive welfare system. Alternatively, Afghanistan has one of the lowest income inequalities in the world, but they're all just more equally poor in absolute terms. Obviously, there's a lot of other factors than inequality itself, but I use that analogy to illustrate that inequality isn't as good of an indication as one might initially think. Another critical oversight in the argument that excessive inequality, a commonly unqualified term, what level of inequality is unacceptable, is necessarily bad, is overlooking the manner in which the inequality arises, whether it's by political favors and corruption or by market mechanisms and voluntary exchange. Given Singapore, again, has more inequality than the US, but fewer or if any of the problems commonly claim to be caused by excessive inequality, despite having more than the US, this raises serious doubts about either what is causing these problems or the impact of inequality itself. It may be that the inequality is at best a symptom of an underlying problem, but not the problem itself necessarily. The IZA, a German labor-friendly think tank, sought out to see if that may indeed be the case, and they did a statistical analysis of OECD countries, and they found that when inequality arises through political favors, it absolutely can be a problem for economies. It's overall negative growth for economies. But if it occurs absent of these or with very small amounts of political favors, it actually is good for the economy, at least to the extent that the inequality exists currently. Of course, if these findings hold true, that means two things. First, even where inequality is due to political favoritism, the solution isn't redistribution. And I know that Dr. Burgis was not necessarily suggesting redistribution, but the solution is to root out the political favoritism. And secondly, where inequality does arise through markets, that is good for the economy and people overall. And when it boils down to it, without inequality, we wouldn't have an economy. And that was it. I took notes during your opening, Burgess, Dr. Burgess. I figured that'd be a good starting point to discuss.
Sure.
So, I did have one clarifying question. Your number 3, I wrote down. I was writing down all 4. Could you clarify what you meant on number 3? Because I wasn't sure what the actual inequality to which you objected.
Sure. So number 3 was just any level of inequality that resulted in people having much worse lives than they would, given the same resources being distributed more equally.
Okay. So I'm just going to go down the list if that's okay, and feel free to take.
Sure. Yeah.
Are we ready to go in an open discussion now, or are we still in the opening?
Oh, that's a good question.
I'm done with my opening. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess we're in open discussion.
All right. Yeah. Go ahead and stop the timer then, and
start the 55-minute timer.
Let's go ahead and kick it off, gentlemen.
Okay. Yeah, no, there's definitely stuff I wanted to ask about from yours too, but sorry, you want to go through these one at a time. Let's do that.
All right. Well, so the first thing is the CEO pay one. This, I think, is another instance of kind of math without proper context. Yes, like, for example, you'll look at the example I like to bring up is like McDonald's CEO made $20 million last year. And that sounds like a lot more than any McDonald's worker. But if you actually took that in,
I don't think it just sounds like it. I think it is it.
Right. But if you take that entire 20 million and divided it among I think it's 1.6 million McDonald's employees, it would amount to 25, I think it was half a cent an hour more. So while it's a big number, but it's not as if his pay, even if it was reduced to zero and distributed among all the workers, their pay isn't going to be all that much different.
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple things going on here. And I think part of it depends, of course, the revenue from McDonald's that doesn't go into new investment and that doesn't go into worker pay is certainly not confined to the pay of the CEO. But which is relevant if we're thinking about like a version of McDonald's that was organized as a co-op or something. But also remember, so the point about CEO pay is a point about the extent of disparity. But then the next question is, if that's bad, right, which I think it is, why is it bad? And so the first one that I mentioned is that level of disparity, leads to large-scale inequalities in power. If you are the CEO of McDonald's and you call your congressman, you will most definitely, if not in the moment, that day, get to have a conversation with the congressman himself. Whereas if you're one of those workers, you'll be lucky to have an extended conversation with an intern or maybe somebody from a temp agency. So that kind of significant, the fact seems to be, and maybe you dispute this, right? But the first part of the first point was that large scale inequality, economic inequalities, tend to result in large-scale inequalities in political influence.
I'm not necessarily convinced that's the case either, because if you look at pre-tax inequality in a lot of developed countries, some of them are at similar levels than the U.S. Pre-tax inequality. I mean, if you look at, say, Finland, for example, they don't have this, much like the U.S., they lack restrictions on total campaign spending or contributions, and yet they don't really see the same levels of corruption that we have in the U.S. And I think a better explanation for a lot of the lower levels of corruption we see in Europe and Canada is that corruption is a symptom, and so what money in politics, I think, is the symptom, not the problem, and because there's so much power to be captured, and it's so concentrated. But in Europe, you have far more legislators per capita, and you have far more local and regional, provincial, state legislation. So the power is diffused more. So securing the loyalty of any particular legislator doesn't go as far, especially with a parliamentary system that has more turnover. I think that is a better explanation for why they have less corruption. And I'm all for going more towards that, especially with the mixed member representation and all that. And that's a separate question to economic inequality. Maybe it's not. But yeah. As for the fact, I'm sorry, I've got all these thoughts.
It's okay. It's okay. I just thought you were done, but keep going.
As for the CEO pay, yes, the CEO pay has more money by himself, but collectively, McDonald's workers, their total pay exceeds that of the CEO by a good deal. CEO So I mean, if those workers were to organize and even just contribute a little bit of money each, if each of one of them contributed $15, that's more than the entire pay of the CEO that they could give towards a particular PAC if they wanted to.
Okay, so that might be a good place to pause because
Sure,
I think
go ahead.
you said a few different things there. So I think that I wouldn't want to equate the issues of man, I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Can you hear that? Okay. So I wouldn't want to equate the issues of unequal political influence with the issue of corruption. It's certainly true that one way that that people with vastly more concentrated wealth can have more influence than people with vastly less is like handing out bribe money. That's one channel between concentrated economic power and concentrated political power. And it's one that Americans tend to focus on a lot and kind of have a charmingly naive belief that we can campaign finance or reform our way out of it. But I actually don't think it's the most important channel. I think that because there are plenty of places that have far stricter campaign finance laws than the United States, where it's still the case that the owners of capital have vastly more political influence than any particular individual working class person. In fact, I think every country in the world satisfies that description. So just as one quick example, another channel between concentrated economic power and concentrated political power that has absolutely nothing to do with bribery or corruption or campaign finance is the business veto, that if you do things that displease the owners of businesses, at least large businesses, they can always take their business elsewhere. And that risk of capital flight is something that effectively disciplines the egalitarian ambitions of governments all around the world, and is in fact, I think, actually a much more effective means of discipline. I think I would also point to ownership of media and the way that's linked to political influence, even on voters in that case, by not very many corporations. But the last thing I did just want to say was on the point, the McDonald's example, just sticking with that for a second. Sure, if every single McDonald's employee got together and made a coordinated effort to exert political influence, then they could, they wouldn't have exactly the same abilities, because they don't have the power they don't have the power to influence company decision making in ways that politicians would worry about. They might but they can go on strike. They have various ways of exerting political influence. But of course, the point is that it's much, much, much easier for people with concentrated economic power to exert, concentrated, political influence. That you don't have the same kinds of collective action problems with making that happen that you do with a variety of ordinary people. Because I think it's always true in any kind of hierarchical system that sure, if all of the people at the bottom, resisted that system or made an effort to reform it, then even slavery wouldn't work, with all slaves, resisted at the same time. But I wouldn't conclude too much from that.
Okay. It seems like we more kind of disagree on which is more impactful. I personally think that the concentrated government power is, if addressing that would in effect address the how people wield their wealth, as it were. But
so actually, maybe I can clarify that, because I hear people say this a lot, and I'm not, or at least I hear people say a version of that, and I'm not certain if what you mean is the same as what's often meant by that. So a version that I'll often hear, from like libertarians is, basically, if we had a less, like a state that, that played less of a role in the economy, then the prize, wouldn't be worth as much. But I think you're saying something slightly different because of the things that you said about parliamentary systems and all of that.
Well, it's a little bit of both. Your part of it is, yes, the prize. There's less to gain if you capture that power, but at the same time, it's less likely to be captured it's even harder to stay captured because there are more actors at play that can either be influenced by other groups or go their own way. It's kind of think of it like a cartel. The more members of a cartel, it's harder to really keep everyone on this to behave, as it were.
Mm.
But also when it does get captured, because there's less power to be wielded in that way, less damage is done. So it's kind of it's both of them, and you can regulatory capture is the more power there is, the bigger incentive it is to capture it. The more concentrated it is, the easier it is to capture, and depending on what you either want to reduce the power or diffuse it, and those aren't mutually exclusive.
Sure, you can do both. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right, I got you. Yeah. So I guess I'm not sure about the second claim, the diffusing claim, because it seems to me that at least in the American context, our federalism, the way that so many powers are devolved to states, and the relative lack of centralization, compared to at least some European countries in many ways, actually makes it easier for corporations to get what they want, right? I mean, if Amazon is sort of dangling out the prospect of opening their headquarters in one of 5 places, or whatever, a car company, once is offering to open up a factory, then you'll get state governments tripping over each other, competing to give them the best deal and the most tax breaks, and to roll out the red carpet. I mean, we've seen some dramatic examples of that lately. Whereas a more centralized government, does have more bargaining power there. And I also think historically, just at least in the American context, if you look at the history of things like right to work laws, it seems to be easier for employers, associations and chambers of commerce that lobby for such things to get them done on a state level at a national level. So I'm just not sure that that's actually empirically true, that the diffusing makes it harder for people at the top of an unequal economic setup to exert political influence. But I've always been really confused about the first claim, which is the one I'm more familiar with, because it's a sort of very common, libertarian kind of claim. Not that you're necessarily that, and it always seems like, yeah, okay, if you somehow had a combination of extreme economic inequality, really concentrated economic power, but the state wasn't doing any favors for the people at the top. It was acted the way that it's supposed to, and in the sort of minimalistic libertarian conception of what a state would do. Then sure, there would be no favors being given. But it seems like the claim that somebody like me would make would precisely be that if you have concentrated economic power, the holders of that will inevitably get the state to do them favors. That maybe that could be counteracted with things like the extremely stronger unions you have in places like Finland. But all else being equal, that's just going to happen. That saying, the idea that you could have capitalism that wasn't crony capitalism, that you'd have this much economic inequality going on, but it just wouldn't translate into the state intervening in the economy on behalf of the people with lots of it, has always been very confusing to me. I don't know what the mechanism is by which that would happen.
Well, I think it's important to remember that absent political favoritism, your economic power is based on how well you provide products that people demand. I mean, if you're not doing that, or you're grifting people or whatnot, that power is going to wane very quickly. That's why.
Sure. I mean, although I would point out,
I mean, also in the absence of the state doing favors, it'd probably be easier for unions to form as well. And not just big unions, but unions that may compete with another because they may have disagreements as to how they feel their workers should be represented. Like maybe you'll have young workers that might want higher wages versus middle-aged worker, like, 30s in their 30s, they might want more childcare, for example.
Yeah. So again, I get that, absent political favors, nobody's doing any political favors. But I guess my question is, what's the mechanism by which it would ever be the case that you had this much economic inequality without it translated into political favors through all those channels, right? Like in other words, either, presumably it's not that we think that the people who that Amazon and Walmart and McDonald's and et cetera are going to nobly hold back from trying to do that, right? So it seems to me that attacking the economic power is the only way of reducing the political the political influence over the long term.
Well, I misunderstood your question before. The reason why is that it takes resources to secure, whether it's lobbying or bribes, whatever, however you want to characterize it, it takes resources to do that. And once the politicians are on it, they're going to want a constant stream. So it takes resources to actually get them to be loyal to you. If the amount that you get back from that loyalty is very little, then it's not really worthwhile. Either it's little because the state has little power to really intervene, or it's that you can't, because there's so much turnover, you can't get a big enough coalition to get the state to do what you want.
Yeah. So again, I don't know how this reduction in power is going to happen without a reduction in state power is going to happen without that reduction in economic inequality. I'm skeptical that you could have a state that was strong enough to enforce property rights, but wasn't strong enough to be used in cronyistic ways. But I did just want to. I didn't want it to get lost. You said something a minute ago about how absent political corruption, the only way that economic power only comes from providing goods and services that people want, and not grifting people. And I guess the two things I would say about that were, one, just as a historical fact, even if we're narrowly focusing on that issue, right, the providing of the goods and services to consumers, they actually, I mean, I don't know about, depends a little bit on what you mean by grifting, but massive fraud of consumers, the certainly, wildly unsafe products, going to consumers, et cetera, is something that happened. Well, it still happens quite a bit, but it happened quite a bit more, before the expansion of the regulatory state in the 1970s, with a bunch of consumer protection laws. So, would your view be that those things happening was somehow a result of political favors being done, or political corruption, or is there a way that can happen in the market, just left to its own devices?
Well, it's important to remember that when people refer to free markets, like when they're extolling the virtues of free markets, at least, they don't mean like zero rules at all. There's rules for defining and defending property. There's rules against aggressive violence like fraud and assault and theft. And there's also some means of adjudicating disputes in a kind of court system. So the assumption is that that's in place. As for various consumer safety products, a lot of that actually has been corrupted itself. There are many life-saving drugs that are prevented from being allowed in the U.S. because of the FDA. And it's kind of a bootleggers and Baptist situation because the FDA is just super cautious about everything. And also the enforcement agencies are corrupted because pharmaceutical companies don't want competition. An interesting example is the catalytic converter. When the new emission standards came out, Japanese motor companies, they retooled their engines to meet the emission standards, where American companies, they developed the catalytic converter, which artificially increased the cost of the car slightly. The American motor companies lobbied to have catalytic converters required thus making the Japanese automaker motor companies, their cars had to be more expensive as a result, even though their cars already met the emission standards. So this kind of protection cronyism is increasingly so. Like, for example, there's a regulation, it's like one of the weirdest regulations I saw, where there's a maximum and a minimum for the diameter and thickness of pickle slices. And that's because the companies that make the machines that slice your pickles, they've invested, they want their investment protected, they don't want the competition. It's just kind of silly. Now, that doesn't mean that all consumer protection is like that, but once you put that in place, you create that incentive to capture it and corrupt it in that way.
Sure, but I guess one thing I find a little bit confusing about that answer is that you kind of started out by saying, well, yeah, of course, you have laws against all of these ways that companies, historically have, and still continue to. I mean, like, no law is perfectly enforced, but but certainly, like, in the early 70s, at the time that, like, Unsafe at Any Speed was coming out, and the big push for a lot of these consumer regulations was happening in just rampant ways, right? And so the first thing you said was, well, of course we'd have laws to stop stuff like that, right? So you're sort of accepting the basic framework that there are laws, some sort of consumer protection laws in place, and then you started talking about regulatory capture and the process being corrupted to prevent competition. And so I guess one thing is how the two halves of that answer fit together, right? I mean, if the idea is that there's like, some consumer protection laws, but like little enough that we're not gonna have a regulatory capture problem given concentrated economic power, then is that little going to be enough to prevent, like, lots of people dying from stuff like unsafe cars, like that Nader example?
Another thing that's also to consider is that before the APA kind of existed in earnest, you could sue. You had a lot more ability to sue companies that dumped on your land or dumped near your land and it got into your water system and whatnot. Once the EPA came along, they basically decided what did and didn't count as pollution, and then narrowed what counted as standing. So the issue, I think, is that I think it's more of a tort reform issue. I was referring to laws mainly against aggressive violence, and in that case, that kind of would be if it's just dumping on your land. Yeah, I think so when you have regulators defining what does and doesn't count as harm, people who are harmed may no longer have a reprieve, and people who have not been harmed can now claim to be harmed, and then. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, though.
No, I don't think it does, because
Okay.
the question was, if you could somehow, you wave a magic wand and you reduce the consumer protection part, right, which is all we're talking about here right now, because and that's also something we don't want to get lost, that of course the dangers of the problems with economic inequality, like, I think every single thing I said would be completely consistent with every single company that's enriching owners or investors, making good products and and satisfying consumer needs. I think all of my objections to economic inequality are completely consistent with that scenario. But of course, we know in real life that hypothetical is not realized. That there is lots of fraud. That of various shades of subtlety. That oftentimes companies will put wildly unsafe things on the product, on the market, and a la the main character's day job in Fight Club. If like there's a sort of decision about whether to pull things off the market, that's a calculation about how much you think that you're going to lose from being sued. And so the question was, do you think that if we could wave that magic wand and somehow shrink the regulatory apparatus for consumer protection down to some level that you think wouldn't be an attractive reward for regulatory capture, if that nub that was left would be enough to stop, like, lots of people dying because of unsafe products, for example?
Well, if you take that away and you open up the fact that companies will still be much more liable, because a lot of those regulations in place also limit the liability of those corporations. Then corporations have to do a recalculation, like you said with the narrator in Fight Club. If you make it not worthwhile, bakeries aren't going to just poison. Pardon me. Bakeries aren't just going to poison their customers intentionally or even just recklessly. But there is sometimes it's like, well, sometimes a small amount might get in and it's not going to kill you, but some of the limits are arbitrary. This is just like, for example, when it comes to the nuclear community, like a lot of your nuclear exposure limits are orders of magnitude lower than what is unsafe to be exposed to, and that's partly just that people are kind of irrationally scared of nuclear. Part of it is also lobbying on both the part of environmentalists as well as fossil fuel lobbyists. So again, it gets back into the whole bootleggers and Baptists parable, where you have multiple parties with different motives that are for this policy, and the greedy versions of why therefore kind of get a plausible deniability because of the more noble intentions behind it.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, I do think it would depend on how we would reform, tort reform. But I do like this topic, but we probably should move on to another section.
Yeah.
It should be your turn. You probably had a question.
This might be a good chance.
So can I just really quickly say, Kaz, before? So first of all, we can separate out the tort reform issue. We could limit caps on how much you sue people for while keeping the regulatory state in place. But second is just counting on torts to do the job only works when you have the funds for a good lawyer, and sometimes good lawyer will take on a case for prestige or whatever, but assuming that that's going to happen enough for the people who most desperately need redress, I think is a pretty heroic assumption.
Perhaps, but if you don't have much of a case, then you're not being able to. You probably won't get to find a lawyer anyway. So if you can't prove your case, then what's the solution to that? That's
regulation is the solution. Because the whole point of regulation, rather than just leaving it all to the tort system, is that we don't have to wait for something to this provably impacted me, and I have the time and the resource to investigate it and to get a good lawyer to make my case. We just have to have, you're recklessly, we're not going to be intentionally poisoning, the bakery products, but we recklessly, let unsafe products out onto the market that have the danger of killing lots of people. And I think if you lack the resources to do all the things you just said, I think, the regulatory state, as imperfect as it is, see where we started about how I'd, like to change the economic system in general, but as imperfect as it is, I think it's a much better solution than torts.
Well, the issue is that regulation doesn't necessarily prevent harm. Even this regulation in place is meant to stop this harm, but how do you know how much harm would have actually occurred with the regulation not in place? And not only that, but it functionally turns into...
Same point goes for torts.
We'll revisit that. I'm gonna have my second thought, and then we'll revisit that because I want to hear that. But by saying, "Hey, you have to prove this is safe," as opposed to having to demonstrate harm, you're functionally putting a regulatory cost on corporations, or at least producers, that they're guilty until proven innocent.
Yeah, I think that's entirely appropriate. I don't think that the reasons why we have such a high burden for proof in criminal law apply in this case. I think having to prove that your products are safe, I don't see that as a deep rights violation in the way that putting people in prison or executing them, with the burden on them would be a deep rights violation.
But you're still. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Okay, Kaz, do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
While you think about how you want to respond to that, let me just say to the audience one quick second that if you are enjoying what you are seeing and hearing, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit that like button, please. If you are enjoying what you're hearing from one of the speakers in particular, you can check out the description box. One of their links will be there. You can go and check out their channel or wherever they are located, and you can hear more from them. And also, if you have any questions for the speakers, if you have any comments for them, please send a super chat. Or if you don't want to send a super chat, you can ask a question. But super chats do get priority; they will be read first. So please send us a super chat so that we can ask the debaters questions. Our Q&A will be starting in about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. And I think that's all I wanted to say. So go ahead, gentlemen.
So I got my train back on track. So the violation of rights thing, the issue there is, so I have no problem with companies being prosecuted for fraud, saying this product does this, what it doesn't, including, the scope of its function that it claims is safe. I'm okay with that because that's functionally fraud. But at the end of the day, we're essentially holding corporations responsible, to a degree at least, where if people are abusive or reckless with that product and it ends up being unsafe, it's on the corporation then. So, I mean, there's a balance there. And that's why, I mean, maybe it was a stretch to say, like, they're all guilty until proven innocent. It was more to kind of characterize it that way, and that I am reluctant on a lot of strict liability crimes, because I think you should not punish people when the harm has occurred. You certainly shouldn't punish people before potential harm has occurred. I believe you're muted, sir.
My apologies. So the idea that punish people, before harm is occurred, seems like a very weak reason to me to oppose stopping people from doing things that we know have an unreasonable potential for harm. Now, if you're much more worried about companies being unreasonably stopped from doing things that are safe, then you are about people, about actually unsafe products being put out and victimizing people who are often not going to be in any sort of position to sue. Realistically, don't really have the resources to even do the initial investigation. Then I guess that makes sense. But I mean, my priorities would be the opposite on that one. And the thing you said earlier that you wanted to hear was about the parity argument about regulation and torts, which is that. And if you want to move on to other stuff, we don't have to do the whole thing on this, but just really briefly, because you did ask about it. The parity argument was just that you could equally say we don't know if we hadn't made it really easy to sue people, right? We don't know how much harm would have happened that was that was prevented by making it this easy, because presumably in both cases, a big part of the point of either making it really easy to sue people or imposing regulations. And by the way, I'm for both, but but either strategy, a big part of the point is deterrence. And yeah, that is somewhat hard to measure. I'm not convinced that we don't have reasons to think that the sort of consumer safety and environmental laws that came in the 70s have led to less harm. I suppose it's possible that there would have been that much less harm anyway, independently of them. But man, I would sure rather err on the safe side on that.
I see what you mean, and that's a decent parody. I'm inclined to agree that it really is it comes down to we don't really know, and we could talk about this more. I think we should move on to another element. And I asked you a question about that, and then we branched off to a whole bunch. I think you should, unless you want, we can go down my list. But you wanted to ask me a couple things.
I'm happy to go down the list. I guess in a bigger sort of picture way, right? Like it seems like a lot of what your opening statement was some combination of how bad the sort of immediate utilitarian effects of economic inequality are, and then that was one big thing that was about and the other was about degree of economic mobility, right? So it's not as bad that people at the bottom are way worse off as people at the top if you could make your way from the bottom to the top. And I think that was the defense of it. I think those were the two big defenses of inequality that was here and there.
Well, so for the second part, it wasn't just it was more that your ability to move through the relative income quantiles isn't what mattered. It's what was your absolute buying power.
Mm-hmm.
Like how much do you have and how far it goes. If you have enough to get by, or even like have enough, even afford a few luxuries, why does it matter at all how much more somebody else has? How much more they have is going to have little effect on your buying power, for example. And
okay. I mean, it does, right? I mean, like like how much more they have does actually, in the moment, we can argue about long-termism and whether and whether allowing this makes everybody's buying power greater over time, et cetera. That'll be kind of the standard argument. But certainly there's no denying that in the moment, some people having more buying power absolutely does mean that you have less. I mean, there are finite resources, and this is the system for allocating that. And if some people have more, then absolutely some people have less. And if the question is, well, if you can get by and have a few luxuries, then what does it matter that you have so much smaller share of the pie that there is to finite resources to go around than someone else does? And I think that there are a bunch of reasons why that would matter. I mean, one is brought up by the equality of opportunity point, which is that if there's no good reason for that, right, then it does seem unjust if some people are arbitrarily being denied that. So if you have a smaller share just because you chose not to work very hard, or you made different choices about work-life balance, then fair enough, I might not quarrel with the justice of that. But if it's because of factors outside of your control, that is presumably something that I think most of us would recognize as a reason to find unequal distributions unfair. I mean, you've brought up political favoritism and corruption many times, and there are different reasons why you might be opposed to one of those things, but surely one of the reasons is the unfairness of it, right? Why should some people have a leg up over others because of political favoritism and corruption? That's surely one of the reasons that we object to racial discrimination, for example. That you wouldn't say, hey, if Black people face certain kinds of discrimination at a given point, well, as long as the average Black person has enough to get by and a few luxuries, then no harm, no foul, right? You say no, that's deeply and objectionably unfair, and then we can kind of go through all of the other reasons. But I would say everything that I listed off in the original is a reason why we should still object to that point. I guess the only one that it would be relevant to is the one about absolute quality of life. But even there, I would really question the idea that economic inequality is irrelevant to that. That if you look at all the studies about comparative life expectancy, for example, in wealthier and poorer zip codes, often within the very same city, sometimes very close to each other. I mean, I guess you could say that the condition of people in the poor zip codes who live like 30 years less on average in some American cities, that has nothing to do with the condition of people in wealthier zip codes. There's nothing that we could do in terms of redistributed resources that would raise that quality of life and raise that life expectancy. But man, that does not seem very plausible.
Well, I want to touch on equality opportunity because it is my opinion. Equality opportunity is this weird nebulous term in politics, in my opinion. And my experience, anecdotally, of course, is progressives tend to use it, but then they would point to disparities in outcome and say that must be due to unequal opportunity. And I'm speaking generally, it doesn't necessarily apply to you. And then conservatives will say, I'm for equal opportunity, and they look for equal treatment. And if there's equal treatment, there must be equal opportunity. So it really, I think, seems to be a code word, for lack of a better term, for what their real political priorities are. And again, I'm not necessarily projecting either of those onto you. So my question is, when you talk about equality of opportunity, what do you mean by it?
Yeah, so I think I gave the definition that I would use in the opening, but we could recap it and maybe go into a little bit of some of the differences between different things that people mean by it. G.A. Cohen is a 20th century socialist analytic philosopher I like a lot, and he makes a distinction between three kinds of equality of opportunity. What he calls bourgeois equality of opportunity, which just means there's no legal impediment to anybody from any background rising to any given level. So you don't have, apartheid laws, for example, but it's a sort of purely negative understanding of equality of opportunity. And then you could have what he calls left liberal equality of opportunity, where you recognize certain kinds of social disadvantages that you need to compensate for them in order to put people on a level playing field. He gives the example of Head Start programs. And then what he calls socialist equality of opportunity, which is what I mentioned at the outset, which is the idea that it is in principle objectionable. And we can talk about what that means in a second, but it's in principle objectionable if some people have less access to resources than other people due to factors outside of their control. Now, when I say in principle objectionable, I don't mean that there's no circumstance under which, on balance, that might be the lesser evil to allow that to continue to happen. There's certainly inequalities in outcome that there's no reasonable way to correct for. Even inequalities in outcome that stem from things that are outside of anybody's voluntary control. But all else being equal, unless there's some other really important value that this is getting in the way of, that I do think that a virtue of social orders is when they when they at least come closer to it being the case that you don't have inequalities in outcome that stem back to things that are outside of anybody's control, because intuitively that does seem to be pretty central to why we object to caste systems or feudalism or or racial discrimination or gender discrimination, or et cetera, right? Like, there are arguments you can make against all of these things on purely utilitarian grounds, that if we have racial discrimination, the smartest people from certain races won't be making their contributions to science, and et cetera, et cetera. But that might be part of why you're against it. But I think for most people, that's not the main reason that you're against it, right? I mean, the main feeling that racial discrimination in that example is unfair comes from the fact that people are having worse outcomes, not because they chose to work less or anything like that, but because of factors completely outside of their control, like in that example, what your skin color is. And we could add to that, what economic position you're born into, and the point seems to be largely unaffected by the change.
Well, I even somewhat disagree in that I don't think the objection is based on things outside of our control. I think it's based on it's objective when it's based on something that we don't think should matter. For example, people's religion is completely within their control, but we still find it unacceptable to discriminate based on religion.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, but I think that it's I would put it a little differently. I would say that what the religion example shows is that the fact that something is not under your control is not the only reason that people having different outcomes based on it would be objectionable, right? But I don't think it shows that it's not one thing that can make disparate outcomes objectionable.
Well, in addition to that, what I mean is some things that are outside of our control do matter. Like our genetics, to a degree, will affect many of our opportunities. I mean, I'm 6'4". I'm not ever going to be a competitive horse jockey.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And if we lived in a society where where one of the only way we were ruled by a caste of competitive horse jockeys,
right.
And the only way to sort of break into the ruling class was by being a competitive horse jockey. That would seem extremely unjust. And one of the reasons it would seem extremely unjust is that it's outside of your control, right? I mean, I would completely embrace this example. I do not think that to the extent that we can reasonably correct for it without violating other values, etc. I do not think that that differences that are traceable back purely to genetic inheritance and not to voluntary choices, should matter for outcomes, whether it's that example or I guess more realistically, historically, like a warrior caste that you could only be in if you were big and strong enough, had all the power and privileges, or in contemporary, liberal capitalist society, just happened to be born with the propensities for more easily developing the skills that help people do well in school and climb through professional ladders, and et cetera, et cetera. If some people have dramatically worse lives because they lack those skills and it's not under their control, of course it's always partially under your control, but if it's to a degree that we're worried about, it's not under your control whether you have those skills. Yeah, that does seem like an objection to having large scale inequality based on factors like that.
Well, and it's my fault for pausing, but I think one of the big factors that is almost completely out of most people's control that greatly affects anybody's economic prospects is geography. And not just I happen to be born in a wealthy country or a poor country, but the African continent is the second largest continent in the world, but it has the least amount of coastline. It has fewer navigable rivers. It has fewer places that are going to be useful for ports. The Zaire River has far more waterfalls and that are bigger compared to the Mississippi. Like this, that doesn't explain all of the problems and struggles that many people living on the African continent face, but that's a huge thing. And even look at the U.S., the East Coast is far more developed than the West Coast. There's far more wealthy people on the East Coast. And that's, one, you just have years, far more years of human capital and capital development. So I guess my question is like, should geography matter? And to what extent should it?
No. I think would be the simplest answer. To give a slightly more nuanced answer, I think that I can certainly see the point that there's a certain kind of moral urgency that underdevelopment in Africa has to Westerners, to the extent that you think that the history of colonialism is causally implicated in that underdevelopment, and a much lesser degree to the extent that you think that factors, like you mentioned, are right. Like we could agree, even if you think, as a background thing, that ideally, right, we would. We would want, right, there are complicated questions here about the extent to which, people are part of a sort of a single, big society, or not. I think with the increasingly globalized economy, that's sort of murkier than ever, but they have, but yeah, I think that in general, to the extent that you can reasonably correct for it, without doing things that that violate other values, then absolutely, inequalities between countries are important, right? And I think that and are objectionable. I think it could be that in the case where you to a much greater extent maybe than you do, blame the history of colonialism for the economic condition of much of Africa, then there might be multiple reasons to want to correct that, and so it might have greater moral urgency than if the only reason is just, well, all else being equal, we would be living in a more just world if you didn't have a way worse life because which country you were living in. But I don't think that there would be no moral reason to want to correct for that if it just sort of arose immaculately in a way that I will say I think very few really inequalities really do.
Okay. Now this one's a little weirder, and I forgot about it. I should have brought it up earlier. It's what about time? So it's undisputable that white Americans have far more wealth on average than Black Americans, and to a great degree. But it's also true that the average white person is almost twice the age of the average Black person. And the reasons for which are itself something we can unpack. But nonetheless, simply born in a certain time or living longer
Mhm.
Like that's mostly out of our control as well. Should that be equalized? When you look at inequality distribution chart, like the distribution of income in
Mhm.
countries, it often lines pretty well up with the distribution of age, and which makes sense as you get older, you build up skills, your income generally increases to a degree, you build up capital and wealth and whatnot. So
Well,
to what extent should that be a factor to be corrected for, even though it's something we largely can't control for?
yeah, I mean, I think so. First of all, I think in the case of Black and white Americans, I think that there's exactly one plausible explanation for that, and it's the fact that poor people on average have much shorter life expectancies than wealthier people do on average. So so given like most racial disparities, I think it could be traced back to that they have that the distribution of poverty among the races is wildly unequal because of the history of slavery and Jim Crow and FHA redlining and etc. Within living memory, and so because of that unequal distribution of poverty, due to our apartheid past, then you have all of the social ills that go with poverty are also unequally distributed, and that would be the case even if there was zero racial prejudices in anybody's mind in the present day. So I think the much shorter life expectancy that tends to go with poverty is going to be by far the most important explanation. I think a lot of other explanations are going to be indirectly caused by that. But on principle, imagine that we lived in a utopia where there was no bad racial history, where nobody was in a worse position because of what economic location they were born into, et cetera, et cetera. But it was still the case that older people on average were doing better off than younger people. I do think that would be less objectionable than a lot of these other inequalities, because I think when we're concerned about about lack of resources, about quality of life, et cetera, we're concerned with how good a life one person is living versus how good a life another person is living. So, if you're going to be doing better as you go on, then you have much less of a legitimate complaint than somebody who's not going to. Which is one of the reasons that union seniority systems are awesome, and giving employers more flexibility about stuff like that is terrible.
Okay. There's a lot of debate over the extent of the effect of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. It's difficult to really discern. I think a number of economists, I think, have at least is a good experiment in using how not just African Americans, but immigrants of African descent that came from a place that spoke English, they came from a place that had its own legacy of slavery in the Anglo-Caribbean, and then when they immigrate to the U.S., to what extent does that affect them? Because they're coming from just as if not more poor places. They are unambiguously black. In fact, if anything, they're on average darker than the average African American. So whatever levels of systemic racism that are at play, but they tend to be overrepresented among high income blacks. They tend to be overrepresented among blacks.
Yeah, but that's not at all a comparison of like to like, because you're not talking about you're not talking about random members of groups being taken, like your number came up in the where, like, it's not like the people running this experiment have the power to make people move to the United States. You're talking about people who have in fact made it to the United States, and so I think it's going to be an extremely limited subset that's going to be wildly unrepresentative of the larger group. I think the larger point, that even apart from the fact that would be a hell of a weird coincidence, that the descendants of slaves on average are doing so much worse than descendants of non-enslaved people, and an even bigger coincidence that that people whose parents or grandparents were living under Jim Crow and just de jure apartheid within living memory are doing so much better than people for whom that's not the case on average. That would be but even beyond that, I think I think it's very hard to deny that on average, if you're born into poverty, you're more likely to end in poverty than somebody who wasn't. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are born into poverty who manage to be upwardly mobile. Of course there are. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who aren't born into poverty who fall into it. Of course they are. But I think it's very implausible to deny that if you're born into poverty, that considerably raises your chance of ending up in it.
Oh, I don't think I wouldn't dispute that being born in poverty, you're more likely to die in poverty than someone who wasn't. I mean, that doesn't. But that I don't know if that really is necessarily relevant because.
Well, the relevance would just be that if you have like start with the moment, right? Whatever moment you think this is, right? That like okay, we have no more racial discrimination. We're equal playing field starting now, right? That at that moment. It is going to be the case that poverty is very unequally distributed because of all the legal discrimination, et cetera, right? And so given that, if you have many more, if you have disproportionately a larger, portion of Black people than the portion of white people who are born into poverty, and you accept that somebody who is, that somebody who's born into that somebody who's born into poverty is more likely to die in poverty, then I think once you put those two together, you have to acknowledge that at least a significant chunk of racial disparity comes from that history.
I won't dispute the possibility, but like you're absolutely right that there could be a selection bias in those from the Afro-Caribbean immigrating to the U.S. in terms of the composition of the people that are coming. But the same could be said about the composition of the slaves that were brought here or the immigration patterns. Yeah. So, well, my point is that I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm saying is that it's not as clear cut as I think a lot of people claim on both sides. I know a lot of people when I bring up that stat about the Anglo-Caribbean, a lot of people on the right like, well, that's case closed. I'm not going to look any further. Like that's not the right reaction either. But
yeah, I would just think that again, if you acknowledge that that at the moment of the end of legal discrimination, many more Black people are because of that living in poverty than many white people. That's an uncontroversial historical fact.
Yes.
And you also acknowledge that somebody born in poverty is at least more likely to die in poverty, then that putting those two together, short of one hell of a confounding factor that I'm not sure what that would be, right? Like, but putting those two together, that seems to give you a lot more than just the bare possibility of it, right? I mean, that seems to give you a really good reason to think that is at least a really significant factor. And I also don't think that there's really much of an analogy between saying that that people's that of course who's going to what categories of people with what life plans, etc., are going to make the effort to immigrate in the first place. Not to mention, of course, that there are a lot of things about our immigration system that it's a very difficult process, right? We don't make it easy, right? So I think that people who A, make the effort in the first place, and B, successfully jump through all the hoops, et cetera, are going to be very unrepresentative. And I have a hard time seeing an analogy between that and saying that, well, maybe enslaved ancestors of Black people born in the United States had some feature that they had in common that was different from Africans that were not enslaved. It's at the very least, it's a lot harder to see it's much less obvious what that cause and effect story looks like than in the immigrant case. And also, I think that's packing a lot. Obviously heritable traits, etc., but that's packing a lot into heritable traits over a very long period of time, especially because the most obvious genetic difference between the ancestry of African Americans and and people who who were born into countries from from whom the ancestors of many African Americans were taken, is the higher percentage of white ancestry of African Americans. So unless that for some reason causes causes people to have some sort of heritable trait that makes them not rise through the economic ladder as well, then it seems like by far the simplest and most compelling explanation would just be more Black people in poverty coming out of legal discrimination, plus people born in poverty more likely to end up in poverty.
Well,
after you have your last words, Sphincter Doom, let's go ahead and wrap it up after you have your last.
So I absolutely agree that the day after Jim Crow was repealed or the emancipation, it's not as if everything was great. I'm not suggesting that. I think a big thing that's overlooked is and you have to be very careful when you propose this because it's often abused, but Black American culture was forged through the crucible of slavery and Jim Crow, and it is distinct from Black Britons or Black Australians or Dominicans. So it's not genetics, but culture. There are elements of the culture where some of them eschew certain particular fields, or you're going to college, you're doing what the man is. Plus, there's a subculture that is part of the drug war. The drug war. Blacks kill themselves at 3 to 5 times the rate that whites do, and this is largely due to gang warfare because of the drug war with cartels, and there's a cultural element to that as well. And then you grow up in that, it reinforces. I'm not blaming anybody. You're right, it's part of your cultural DNA, and so these are harmful things that have to be accounted for. I don't think they necessarily fully explain it. Culture doesn't fully explain it. Genetics doesn't explain it. I don't think any one factor explains it. And because the attempt to explain it is so politicized that we're not really asking the right questions, kind of thing. And it's a complex topic, and I'm not sure what the answer is. I just think that I don't think we should just look at one or just look at the other, but it's difficult to really coalesce those factors in a meaningful way.
All right. Thank you so much, Sphincter of Doom and Dr. Ben Burgis, for this riveting discussion. I want to let everybody know and remind you that the debate con is coming up. Hannah Anderson has just placed in the chat a link to the crowdfunding. So if you would like to support James and Modern Day Debate in putting on this debate con, then the crowdfunding link is there, so you can go ahead and contribute to the pot. I also want to thank you guys for having this discussion. So we don't have a lot of questions.
I saw a question in the chat that wasn't a super chat, but I can answer it.
Yeah.
Someone noticed that I was popping cough drops. They're asking what brand, and they're Halls, and they're specifically the cooling strawberry Halls, and they taste good, and the mentholated filling feels nice. So that's why I picked them.
Well, I'm gonna give you what we have. You guys can talk about it as much as you want or as little as you want. If any more super chats come in, of course, we'll read them until we call it a night, and then that'll be it. But if you do have any questions or comments for the debaters, please send them in now. And again, their links are in the description, so please click them if you like what you've heard tonight. If you want to learn more about them, please check them out. Like, share, subscribe, the like button. We have 62 likes right now and 143 viewers, so I know we can get more likes. So please like the stream, guys. And okay, so super chats. We have a $2 super chat from Bubblegum Gun at Ben. Should the state have inequality of violence?
That's odd phrasing, but I think that, of course, a big part of the function of a state is to take violence out of the hands of private vigilantes. That's one of the things that you hope for in a state. Of course, states also perpetuate a lot of violence in waging wars abroad that I certainly view as wildly illegitimate. But but I think even putting aside the terrible state that we have right now and thinking about a much better state, then yeah, I do want there to be an inequality in sort of ability to use violence between me and you and Josh on the one hand, and people who are tasked with certain kinds of enforcement on the other. Again, I'm very not crazy about the enforcement system that we have right now. I think we can do a lot better. And I certainly don't think that ordinary people, that like random citizens should have no legal right to use violence. I mean, even very authoritarian regimes generally recognize some kind of right to self-defense, and and that's as it should be. But I think if you have a world where a lot of where the response to people being sort of interpersonally victimized isn't vigilantism and vendettas, that sounds like a better world to me. And I think that it's also pretty bad when you end up with people who have concentrated economic power. It's bad enough when they're exercising political influence to get the state to do what they want. It's even worse when they're allowed to just have private armies like the Pinkertons who would kill strikers in the Gilded Age. So yeah, I do think so. I also, again, on this whole question of violence or aggression or coercion or any of that stuff, anything swirling around there, I would just reiterate the point I made in the opening about why I think that when we're talking about distribution of resources, those are largely red herrings, because any system for distributed resources is going to be backed up by coercion, or else it's going to very quickly not exist. The question on the table is always, which distribution of resources should be backed up by coercion? Do we think that ships fall where they may in a free market, and whatever the result is fine? Is that our theory of what a good system of distribution is? Do we think that something much more egalitarian in that equality of opportunity way I laid out earlier is a good distribution of resources? I think these are good substantive things to argue about, but I think all of these questions about violence and coercion and all of that are largely a red herring in that discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question we have, well, this is a comment from Adam Abila, 15 shekels, 35 short of a freshly raped virgin from here you go, MDD. Now we have 2 super chats. Hooray. Thank you so much, Adam. Joe Schwartz for $1.99 for both. What's your favorite South Park episode?
Ooh. You go first.
My favorite, and granted, I haven't seen some of this newer stuff. I have to go with this classic Scott Tenorman episode.
Yeah, that is definitely a top 5 South Park episode. I'm in a similar situation there. Like I don't know, I can remember, like I definitely went through like way the hell back when I was like getting stuff from video stores, the early seasons, and I remember watching a lot of it as it was coming out in like 2010, 2011, and then I really stopped for a long time. I will say, actually, that at the risk of dodging the question, I will say that I think that their coverage of the 2016 election was excellent. That the South Park satire of that election was actually some of the best commentary on what was going on there that I've seen from anyone. But yeah, God, let me think about that. Yeah, Scott Timmerman is very good. I think just trying to think about actually here's one I like a lot. Honestly, I don't know that it's better than Scott Timmerman, but I don't want to just repeat your answer, and so I'll just say one that I like a lot is the toilet papering episode, where they have the kids toilet paper the art teacher's house, and then, well, I'm not going to give away everything that happens in the episode, but there's a discussion at the end between the other kids and Cartman about feeling empathy. We care about other people, Eric. That is like one of the funniest things I think in the entire show.
Okay. Thank you so much. Did you guys both get to answer that?
Yeah, at length.
Okay. Where are we? That was Joe Schwartz. We have another one from A Long Story Short for $5. I grew up with Caribbeans my entire life. They never thought of themselves as victims. That is why they are successful. I think that is for, well, who?
Yeah. So
I think
Josh,
that's more for Ben.
yeah, Josh was the one who brought it up, and it sounds like the commenter is agreeing with him. Yeah, I mean, so I think that that claim, right? I mean, partially gets down to questions about kind of what Josh was talking about, the end of open discussion, you know, the extent to which you think that the sort of main explanation for disparities is culture or the ideas in people's heads, as opposed to more directly material factors. And I'm very skeptical in general of culturalist explanations. I think that, you know, there, if nothing else, there are too many examples of, you know, like ethnic groups that at times when poverty was extremely widespread among them, you had a lot of social ills that people blame on culture, and those decreased lazy, you know, after the economics improved, and it doesn't seem like there's an obvious change in culture. You know, the idea that somebody, you know, like hard striving immigrants are just go getters, and you know that's the sort of main explanation for the disparity. I mean, I guess certainly, you know, the fact that immigration pre-selects for people with given life plans and aspirations and etc., I would deny, you know, that's part of the explanation. In fact, I think that actually kind of reinforces my point, right? That those things only go so far, right? That, you know, that we're not comparing, you know, we're not comparing like just any random Caribbean as they are in the United States, you know, as an immigrant to the, you know, like, you know, just any random Caribbean just wakes up teleported into the United States tomorrow. You know, we're not comparing them to any random African American born in the United States, which would be the like to like comparison. We're comparing people who, whether you attribute it to sort of happenstance, giving people a chance to do one thing or another, or whether you attribute it to people being go-getting strivers or whatever. Either way, right, you're talking about a very different subset of Caribbeans than just like representative cross section of everybody from the Caribbean, and you're comparing that not to like let's just assume for the sake of argument that the questioner's explanation is the correct one, right? Okay, so the like to like comparison would be what's the success rate of the most striving, go-getting, whatever percentage, you know, like of that would be a comparable size percentage of African Americans to the comparably sized percentage of Caribbeans, and even if it is the case, right? You know, maybe it's the case that that would be, you know, you'd have just as much success in both cases. I think the fundamental point wouldn't really be touched by it, right? Because the sort of fundamental point is that if you're born into poverty, it's harder, not impossible, definitely not impossible. Lots of people do it, but it's harder to be, you know, to escape from poverty, to have a different economic location later than it is if you were not born into poverty to stay out of it. And so whatever combination of factors you think might lead some people to be, you know, more successful at that than others in terms of just, you know, sure, those attitudes or particular material advantages at particular moments in someone's life that, you know, that might come up for one reason or another, sheer dumb luck, you know, genetic propensity towards certain skills, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever factors are you think make some people better at escaping poverty than others, if those factors are going to be unevenly distributed, just like the same factors are unevenly distributed among people who are not born into poverty, then you're going to have more people from the first group end up in poverty than the second group, and that would still be by far the best explanation of why you have these racial disparities in poverty?
I'd like to kind of piggyback on that. Just to be clear, I was not referring to the entire Caribbean. I was speaking to the Anglo-Caribbean because I wanted to keep constant the fact that they speak English and African Americans speak English. So it's kind of like Jamaica, Trinidad, parts of the Caribbean that are almost entirely composed of Black people, and they have a legacy of slavery, and they speak the English language. You could even include Guyana and Suriname in that, even though it's South America and not the Caribbean. Interestingly enough, Puerto Ricans that immigrate, they do not see the same pattern as you see from the Anglo-Caribbean. Part of that is because they don't speak English as a native language. Also, but at the same time, roughly 12% of Puerto Ricans are also Afro Latino. So many of them are white Hispanics. So it really raises the question of how much their visible ethnicity or race has an impact on that. But at the same time, I fully concede, like it's difficult to account for the selection issue there, but I don't think it can be completely discounted either.
We do have to keep it short and pithy from now on, guys.
Okay. Just really quickly, I was going to say that I think. I'll certainly take that you're not talking about all Caribbeans as a friendly amendment, but I think everything that I said during the previous few minutes, you could just substitute Jamaicans for Caribbeans, and I think the point would stand.
Okay. All right. So I guess some people wanted to send in some more super chats after we started the Q&A. So moving along. Long Nights YouTubing for $5 says, I wish we would stop calling black people, and white people, whites. I'm sorry. I wish we would stop calling black people blacks and white people whites. We lose the people factor, and it relegates us to a color. Always an us versus them dynamic. I think, do either of you want to comment on that?
I think the rhetorical weight of those words is up to society, and we can decide whether there's some sort of moral aspect to that or not. And I personally don't, or I strive to at least, not to have any kind of more like, blacks versus black people, whites versus white people. I can't say that other people don't, but I'm not sure I necessarily. I sympathize with the sentiment. I don't think it's necessary to have the word people in it for us to consider them people.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that. I will say that usage, blacks, whites, maybe just because it's dated and maybe it's an arbitrary association, but it certainly sounds funny to my ear. Like the more natural way to talk to me would be white people and black people. But I'm also very skeptical that language choices are the sort of main driving force of any of this stuff.
Okay, thank you so much. Moving along. A long story short for $5 says, Ben needs to take a field trip to New York and just talk to Caribbean and West Africans. It will give you insight. Haitians earn the same as average Americans.
Okay. I think the last sentence was the most interesting. That's certainly not my impression for my 6.5 years living in Miami, which has a very large Haitian population. But since it's an empirical question, you would have to look it up and probably do, we could do the YouTube thing where people look it up in 10 seconds and sort of glance at it, and but I think it would probably be a more interesting answer, give it a little bit more time to look into the empirical claim at the end. But I'm always happy to take trips to New York. I like taking trips to New York. I try to do that regularly. And one of the people that I try to see there is actually, by coincidence, Haitian. So it's a fun question. I like it.
I have a question for you, Ben. Morehouse College, that's where you teach, right?
Yeah. So as an adjunct, I actually just started a gig at Morehouse College.
Okay.
But yeah, what was your question?
Well, I mean, Morehouse is in Atlanta. It's a historically black college. So I was curious if of the composition of the student body that you see.
Oh yeah, it's an overwhelmingly black college. Is my this is actually, again, I'm going to be coming in and starting to teach there, so there's not a lot of information that I could give you, but certainly my understanding is that it's an overwhelmingly black college. It's a HBCU is the acronym people use, so it's a historically black college.
Okay.
Cool. All right. The last super chat that I have on my list right now is from Warren Ellis for $5. He asks, have either of you read Anthony Atkinson's book, Inequality? If you had, what do you think of his solutions for the UK and the US? I can't hear you. You're muted.
I was just going to say I'm not familiar with that book. Are you, Josh? Okay. I will say I definitely saw at least one other super chat earlier. I don't know if it got lost in the in the mix.
I do know that one was there was some kind of drama about somebody having a super chat that he didn't want. If anybody knows what super chat Dr. Burgess is referring to, please say so right now. I'm watching this live chat.
Okay,
but
so
if not, we can move on. We do have other questions to talk about.
Okay, so if I'm not just making it up, the super chat I could swear I remember from earlier was it was something like are some people fat because other people are thin or something like that, and if my memory is that correct, I did want to answer that just because it's a it's a fun question. I'd say, yeah, under certain circumstances, absolutely. If you have limited amounts of food to go around, or even if you have economic disparities that lead to some people having less of a less time and and energy to cook healthy food, etc. Or hey, if you're you could also have weight disparities because of undiagnosed medical conditions. You could be really thin because you have a tapeworm you haven't found out about because you don't want to go to the doctor because you don't want the copay.
I have been accused of being anorexic or a tapeworm most of my life, but I just have a crazy metabolism.
Gotcha. Okay. So some other questions. We do have about 5 minutes left. Noob Slayer asks who you are. Speaker of Doom.
Like what? Like what? Cosmically? Like that's an open question. I guess it's more like how I answer that question tells me what kind of person I am. It's like it's a meta question. I mean, I'm a chemical engineer. I'm kind of an econ nerd. I really like debating, not in the contrarian sense. I learned in my youth that you can only learn so much on your own. We all have intellectual and emotional blind spots, and you can only learn so much from those with whom you agree because they likely have those same blind spots. So at some point, you have to subject your views to scrutiny and start talking to people with whom you disagree to learn something new. And that's a big part where I enjoy debate. Sorry.
Thank you so much. John Edwards asks, wait, where is James? Kaz, you moderating? Yes, I'm moderating. James is dedicating his firstborn child to Rumpelstiltskin, as I said in the chat. No, I'm just kidding. He is studying, I believe, or working on his PhD. Skeptic77, are the books behind Ben all books he read? No,
certainly not. There are a lot of books that I've read behind me, but there are also books that I hope to read at some point. I've always been kind of a book hoarder. There's there are all those memes about hey, are you going to read all the books you have before you get more books? And I was like, no, I'm going to get these books. This book's first. When I had it's I always end up giving books away when I move, whatever. I buy too many books. I think actually stuff that's visible is pretty much all stuff I've read, but there's definitely stuff on these shelves. I have no question about that.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. All right. Noob Slayer question. Noob Slayer. I just realized his name is longer than that, or maybe not. Question for both. He says, why care about any of this? What's the ethical argument to even bother considering equality or whatever?
Yes, I guess that's more of a question for me because I'm the one who thinks that we should care about it. That at least all else being equal, it's much better, to have a more equal society. I think that again, I went through a bunch of reasons in the opening. I think that if you think that if you will at least grant me that citizens should have an equality of political power. I think that gives us a reason to care about economic inequality. Maybe you don't care about that. If you care about freedom, then I think making people less vulnerable to the soft coercion of needing to do what others say in order to have people having that sway over them so their material needs met is an important reason. Maybe you don't care about freedom either. If you care about people having lacking equality of opportunity. I mean, I spent a lot of time both in the opening and the back and forth with Josh talking about why I think equality of opportunity is incompatible with large scale inequality of outcome. Maybe you don't care about equality of opportunity either. That's one of the kinds of equality you're asking why we should care about. And then I also said, this was the only remaining one I haven't mentioned, I also said that people having shorter, less happy, more stressful lives because that they could be prevented by someone equalizing resources is a problem. But again, maybe you don't care about that. And if you really don't care about any of this stuff, then we can go back to that South Park episode that I mentioned, where the boys are desperately trying to explain to Cartman, who's just looking at them like they're crazy. No, Eric, we care about other people. And he's just like, what?
So I think both of us should care about this because we care about how the economy is structured, and that affects people one way or the other. And we just disagree on how best to structure the economy and whether, what are the appropriate or the inappropriate constraints, what are any sort of interventions or the standards by which we would judge our actions or inactions. And this is an element of that. And I mean, that's why I care about it. And to answer, like, I do care about opportunity and people's, agency and whatnot, but I don't see them as some sort of singular good. I mean, we talked about the various conditions that should or shouldn't matter at length, and it wasn't even exhaustive. We didn't have the time, but yes, we kind of just, you would probably need much more time to reconcile our views, if ever.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to ask our last questions here. Rock E. Shepherd is asking, what is the best form of government? Do you like constitutional republic? And he's not addressing anyone specifically. So you guys could just give me a yes or no, each of you. To that second question, at least.
I have no problems with a constitutional republic. I'm not sure it's the best. Federations have their advantages and their disadvantages. I don't think there's any one good form of government. A good government is one that isn't oppressive. How about that?
Dr. Burgess?
Oh, sorry. I did the thumbs up earlier for... I think a good form of government is one where that maximizes people's ability and practice to control their own destiny, to determine what happens to them, which I think in areas that touch a bunch of other people means democracy. In areas that are just about yourself, means personal freedom. And I like democracy. I like it so much that I want to extend it to the workplace.
Thank you so much. Okay, so my clock is up for the Q&A. You guys ready to get out of here? Pretty much. I did want to ask you guys a not personal question, but I just wanted to know, Dr. Burgess and Sphincter of Doom, are you guys moral relativists, moral realists, moral objectivists? What would you call yourselves? I just want to know the label. You don't have to expound on it or anything. I just want to know.
I mean, I don't think that there's a short answer to that. I don't think there's a short label that I'm confident is true that I could just give the label. I have some thoughts. I think I'm certainly not a relativist in the sense of like the sort of like 19-year-old, intro to ethics student relativist, it's like, oh, whatever. It's just like opinion, nothing to argue about. Clearly not. But in terms of like meta ethics, I don't know. It's a very big subject, and I would not claim to have like really settled views.
Interesting. And Sphincter of Doom?
I'm kind I'm kind of in the same boat. It's difficult to put those views in a box. I will say, at least for clarification, is that moral relativism just seems very puzzling to me, because at the end of the day, morality is deciding, a framework for acceptable or unacceptable, obligatory or discretionary behaviors, and that either applies to everybody or it doesn't. We may disagree on what those behaviors should or shouldn't be, or what should or shouldn't be in those categories, but it just seems odd to me. But then again, maybe I should look further into it, and it's something I hadn't considered.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, guys. Thank you both so much for this great debate. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up, unless you guys have anything else you want to say. No? Okay. So again, thank the moderators. Thank you to the debaters and speakers for this great discussion. Thank you to the moderators in the chat for keeping everything very civil and working so hard and tirelessly. Thank you to James for creating and maintaining this wonderful platform that we all get to share our ideas and have great discussions on. Thank you to the audience for participating and watching us and making this everything that it is. Thank you to everyone who sent in super chats and elevating the conversation. Thank you to, once again, lastly, the debaters who are the lifeblood of the show. Like, share, subscribe. Once again, we have another debate coming up tomorrow. Dr. Cy Gart and Jen from Church of Entropy for Evolution is going to be debated. The debate con is coming up in a couple weeks, so please support that. Buy tickets if you can. Go down and see them live. And remember to keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. And with that, we are going to be leaving. Have a great night, everyone.